a little bossy. She told me to stand up straight. Am I standing up straight?
The right pair of pants.
Yeah, you know. Well, you all know her. You know how she does. Stand up straight, Wallace. I mean, yes, ma'am. Hey, I don't want to get hit again. Did you all
You're being filmed.
not laugh at Dr. Ron Bradley last week? How do you follow an act like Ron Bradley? I'm still laughing over the fact that his 6-year-old daughter found out that George Washington had died, and she didn't know he had even been sick. And she's crying in the car. Cheryl is trying to console her. George Washington dead. And then when Ron said when he got home in his car and came in, she was still crying over poor George. Well, I can relate to that. She's not the only one. When World War II started, I was 10. That kind of dates me. And everybody, we had, Uncle Sam needs you, and the posters, Uncle Sam, and this, that, and other. And I was so happy that somewhere in my relationship, I had an Uncle Sam. And my older brother, who was 4 years older than me, and he was kind of tacky. He said, "You dumb bunny, Uncle Sam, that's just a fictitious guy." I said, "Uncle Sam is a fictitious? I thought I had an Uncle Sam," so I'm crying and carrying on too. So hey, runs in the family. It's so good to be here today and in this classroom, and also to know that a lot of our class and a lot of our friends have YouTube. We're so fortunate to have YouTube because we can have it. Logan gets it. He zaps it back. You all, Nancy and Janie do a great job of the photography. And then Logan gets it and he zaps it to Mary Lou and she zaps it to everybody. We're very fortunate to have that on YouTube. A lot of people don't realize, and when we had our meeting last week with Logan in the Sunday school, some of the ladies did not realize that they were younger, and she said, we ought to do away with YouTube and things like that and make these people come back to church. Well, they didn't realize that so many of our members can no longer drive, and some of them are in the houses, and they call me, and I know they call you YouTube, and thank you so much for YouTube. And it's great. We just love all of these people that are not here today, but are here in spirit. Now let's get into our lesson for today. We're back in Matthew. The last time I taught, we were in Matthew, and now we're back in Matthew, and we're going to be in the 5th chapter of Matthew. And we're going to have the first 16 verses of Matthew. We're in Matthew's gospel, and you all remember Matthew. This man who was chosen by Jesus to be one of the 12 disciples, who was, before his conversion, a notorious sinner. He was a tax collector, a publican. When Jesus walked into his place of business and said, "Put all of this down, Matthew, put it all down, close up your office and follow me." And Matthew very simply put everything down and walked out of the office, never to come back in. He followed Jesus. And Jesus took a notorious man like Matthew, and like he took Saul and made Paul out of him. Saul, one of the worst sinners you could have. He murdered people, and he was responsible for so much of that. And then he turns out to be Paul, one of the greatest writers and one of the greatest Christians. But back to these tax collectors. All tax collectors were the most despised people in Israel. Jewish society hated and reviled them. I called him a publican. You remember that? What was a publican? A publican was a man who bought a tax franchise. I was vice president of a franchise company, so I know about franchises. He was a publican, and he was a man who bought a tax franchise from the Roman emperor. Remember, Rome ruled Israel as a conquered province at that time. Rome had Roman soldiers posted all over Israel, and that took money. So what did Rome do to figure out how to pay for the billeting of all these soldiers? Well, of course, the Jewish populace should pay. So it was natural for all Jews to hate and resent this big time. They're paying people to keep them in tow. Tax collectors like Matthew paid for the franchise, extorted money from the Israelites, paid the Roman government, and then padded their own pocketbooks with the excess. Many times they had to use strong-arm tactics toward the people. So they hired thugs to beat any rebellious person into submission. Not a pretty picture. Most tax collectors were despicable, vile, unprincipled scoundrels. But when Jesus walked into Matthew's booth and said, "Follow me," the Bible says in Matthew 10, verse 9, as Jesus passed on, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said, "Follow me." So he arose and followed him. This is the only glimpse we have of Matthew from his own gospel. His name is only mentioned one time in the entire long chapter, Gospel of Matthew. But if it were not for Luke, we would know very little about Matthew. But wonderfully, Luke talks a lot about Matthew in his own book of Luke. And only from Luke can we really get to know Matthew. While I was working on this lesson, I found it incredibly interesting that Matthew quotes the Old Testament 99 times in his gospel. He quotes the Old Testament 99 times in his book. That is more than Mark, Luke, and John combined. Matthew may have been ostracized from the temple now that he is a Christian, but he surely knew his Old Testament teachings. I want to talk a little bit about Fast Eddie. And Fast Eddie is going to work into this. You're going to wonder how. I was vice president of franchising for a hotel chain, Days Inns, and we were the fastest growing hotel chain in the world, and it was crazy. And in there, we had 10 men and women, young men and women who were quality assurance people. And they went around all the various properties that we had to inspect them. Now, the reason they did that, they wanted to be sure the quality of the hotels and motels were good, because the investor, the multimillionaire that had bought and had that franchise and he owned the property, he needed to know that they were being run properly. So these quality assurance people were great. I didn't have a lot to do with them unless they were having trouble with a property, and then they might come into my office and say, Mr. Faulkner, we are having trouble, so forth, and we have reprimanded them and so forth. That rarely happened, but it did happen. One of the men that was one of the quality assurance guys, I called him Fast Eddie. Fast Eddie. He was in his early 20s and handsome guy. And I knew he was handsome because he worked from Monday through Friday. Wonderful, a good worker. But Saturday and Sunday he was with all of his women. And he had a bunch of them. And I called him Fast Eddie. I'd say, "Oh man, fast." But on Monday he came to work, and Monday through Friday he did a fine job, no problem. And Saturday and Sunday he was still able to come on Monday. And he was good. Well, I called him Fast Eddie. I thought, "Eddie, you're just Fast Eddie, Fast Eddie." One day, Fast Eddie came in my office and he said, "Mr. Faulkner, can I talk to you a little bit?" And I said, "Well, sure you can." He closed the door and came in. He said, I want what you and your wife have. I said, what? You've never met my wife. He said, no, but I have done some talking around in this office of 400 people in the building. And he said, I know you've got a wonderful wife and a wonderful family. I said, Eddie, I certainly do. He said, I want that. I want that. I want that. I said, Eddie, I quit calling him Fast Eddie. I said, Eddie, are you a Christian? He said, well, I was raised a Methodist. I said, well, let me just say this, Eddie. My wife and I are members of Wyuka Road Baptist Church, a large Baptist church on Peachtree Street. And I said, but right up the street is a wonderful, very large Methodist church on Peachtree Street. And I said, what I would recommend, you're saying you want help. Eddie, go up there and visit that church and get into the co-ed class. I happen to know there is a large co-ed class out there. He said, I'm going to do it. A few weeks went by, and Eddie came, knocked on my door, came in, and he said, Mr. Faulkner, he said, I have met the most wonderful girl. She is a fine Christian girl, and we have started dating, and I think I have found my future wife. Now, how is that going to work into the lesson? Well, we're going to find out. Now that we know a lot about this great man Matthew, in part by Dr. Luke, let's get into today's lesson. I'm going to be reading from the King James Version of the Sermon on the Mount. I selected the King James Version because I think it is the better version for me. And this is Jesus talking and praying on the Sermon on the Mount. First, I'm going to read the first two verses, but they're very important. The very first two verses, Matthew 5, 1 through 2. When Matthew saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to teach them, saying, okay, let's stop here. There's a lot to learn, folks, just from that. There's a lot to learn just from those two. Jesus is becoming immensely popular. His healings and other miracles are attracting very large crowds. Barclay said that in this brief introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, we get two clues to its real significance. First, quote, after he sat down. Now, this is Sunday school. We're all supposed to learn something. Some of you may not know this. When a Jewish rabbi was teaching officially, he would sit down to teach. When he did that, the people saw, oh, he's sitting down. He's got something very important to say. Now, that's different from today. When Dr. Head has something important to say, he stands up and comes to the podium. Back then, Jewish rabbi sat down, and if he was standing and sat down, that meant he had something very important to say. I thought to myself, now he's up on a mountain, and all of those people are there, and he sat down. How can they hear what he's saying? What do you think? Your guess is as good as mine. How do you
Well, I'm sure they did, or they would have left.
Exactly. If they had not heard everything he said, they would have left. I think, hey, Jesus was able to project what he was saying, and they heard every word he was going to say. Don't ask me to figure it out. I'm from Macon, Georgia. Why would I know? But that's exactly right, Nancy. He was heard by every single person. After he sat down, he said that. In the Greek, it could also mean opening his heart and fully pouring out his mind. Now let's get Matthew 5 all the way 3 through 12. The Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they should be filled. That's Fast Eddie. That's Fast Eddie right there. He was hungering and thirsting after righteousness, and he was filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. Isn't that beautiful? All of these blessings. There are two facts we need to take note of. Jesus spoke these words in Aramaic, which was the language of the day. Aramaic and Hebrew have a very common form of expression, which is an exclamation. Oh, the blessedness of. So you could substitute it and say, oh, the blessedness of, oh, the blessed of. But that is fine. So if you wanted to change the wording in your mind when you hear this sermon, think of this important fact. This is, catch this, folks. This is not a sermon of pious hope, but a glowing prophecy of future bliss. This is a happy thing. It is not a sermon of hope. We hope there's a blessedness, but it is a glowing prophecy of future bliss. Secondly, the word blessed in the Greek is makarios, and that translates serene and untouchable. Serene and untouchable. Now, why am I telling you all that? Because the Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek clearly indicate that the Sermon on the Mount is a sermon of joy, of hope, of cheer. It is serene and untouchable. And I would say sometimes if you are having a hard time, and Lord knows what Barbara and her family have gone through lately, and all of us really, if you look back, all of us, we've all had problems. If you're having a hard time, I would strongly recommend that you read the Sermon on the Mount. I think it's a feel-good, and it should be a feel-good reading for you. Jesus was not sitting down droning out these words in quiet servitude, but was preaching words of encouragement and joy. Here we see Jesus as a motivational speaker. And I like that because have you ever heard motivational speakers? Have you ever been around one? Motivational. I think the Gaither group, hearing the Gaither group, and Mary Lou and I went to a lot of their concerts. If you're not motivated by the time you've been through Gaither, you have got a problem. They are motivational singers. Singing can be motivational. Here we've got Jesus as a motivational speaker in the clearest of terms. Let's explore a few of these. Can't do them all. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. In today's word, meek is not a good word. Say somebody's meek, they're meek and all. That usually when you say somebody's meek, it's not a good word. It can mean submission or even being cowardly. That is certainly not what Jesus meant. The Greek translates from the Aramaic and tells it like this: blessed is the man or woman who has every instinct, every impulse, and every passion under control. So blessed is that person who is easily self-controlled. In other words, he or she has the humility to know their own ignorance, their own weakness, and their own need, like Fast Eddie. Fast Eddie is a classic example. He was a young man who had the humility to walk in my office, knock on the door, and say, I need help. I need help. I'm ignorant. I'm having problems. I need what you've got, Mr. Faulkner. I need it. I am absolutely desperate to get it. And thank God, literally, I was just his instrument. It wasn't anything I did except to motivate him to go to that church and to find a wonderful, nice lady. And hopefully, I don't know if he ever married her or what. I think it all looked real good. Now here's another one. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Now the word peace in Hebrew is shalom. You've heard, if you've watched movies, and you hear them say shalom. In Hebrew, peace is never used as a negative term, but it means an absence of trouble. So if anybody ever said shalom, it was peace. It was good. I love you. I like you. I think a lot of you. The last statement made in this Sermon on the Mount by Jesus is rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. Persecution connected with rejoicing was nothing new, and the Old and New Testament writers use it frequently. Jesus reminded them that even the great prophets of old had been persecuted. And we see that in the New Testament. The prophets are persecuted. And the four gospel writers, along with Peter and Paul and others, use the two, persecution and rejoicing, together frequently. If a person has a shallow Christian training through their ignorance of biblical reading and their ignorance of Christian schooling, they would say, wait a minute, how can a person rejoice over being persecuted? Well, that is a good question. The first Christians had to suffer, not only physically, but mentally. You know, we don't realize what these early Christians had to give up. Now, when we become Christians, we don't have to give up anything. We can choose the choice of our church, whether we want to be Methodist, Baptist, Episcopalian, whatever. But the first Christians, they had to suffer, not only physically, but mentally. Every department of their life was disrupted. Back in those days, being a Christian in itself caused disruption. How do you think? How do you think being a Christian? You have been a Jewish fellow and lady, and you've been, there, everything's fine, your family's fine, and you become a Christian. What kind of problem should that raise from you?
Well, in a way, you're rejecting what was, following the law.
Absolutely, Ann. You are rejecting exactly. And the Jewish law, they had like 360 some odd that they had to obey and all. And all of a sudden they become Christians and they can be ostracized. Not only they can be ostracized, but they were ostracized. They couldn't go to the temple anymore, and that was important for them. Here are some examples, right on what Ann is saying. If you were a stonemason, you couldn't and wouldn't work on projects like building a temple to one of Rome's heathen gods. You wouldn't do that. If you were a tailor, you would not construct robes for the heathen temple priest. That is just the tip of the iceberg. Your social life was disrupted. Your home life was disrupted, and on and on and on. Jesus tells them, and he tells us in this Sermon on the Mount, to rejoice and to even be glad because you have a great day coming. Their reward would be so much worth all of that suffering when we all get to heaven. And I love that hymn. When we sing it in the church, when we all get to heaven, that is the most wonderful, wonderful thing. And every single person in this room, and I can say this absolutely, every single person in this room has had problems. You have had deaths in your family. You have lost loved ones. You have lost husbands. You have lost wives. You have lost children. We all have had that. And he tells us in this Sermon on the Mount to rejoice and to even be glad because we got a great day coming. Their reward would be so much worth all of that when we all get to heaven. He also reminded them, as he reminds us, that they would be in the same company as the prophets who came before them. The Sermon on the Mount is as current today as it was 2,000 years ago. I would recommend anytime that you're having a problem, sit down and read the Sermon on the Mount. When we think of all the suffering Jesus talked about, you and I can think of so many of our friends and neighbors who are suffering this very moment. We Christians, we have so much to look forward to. As Jesus finished his Sermon on the Mount, he gave us four more verses of praise and encouragement to the listeners. I have always loved his closing words to those who were listening to him. This is Matthew 5:13 through 16. We're continuing. I love this. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled on by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Is that not glorious? Glorious. When Jesus mentions us being the salt of the earth, and that once salt loses its tastiness, saltiness, it is trampled on, I read that many times, and I wonder if you know this, many times once the salt has lost its saltiness, he said, to be trampled on, remember? They would put it on the floor of their house. And they put it on there, and they kept it on there. Why do you think they put salt on the floor? Is that dumb? Think.
It kills bugs. It
Ex-
kills bugs.
Absolutely right. To keep the bugs out. To keep the hey, you folks are like me. You're spoiled. You had some sweet lady said that. Yeah, to keep the bugs out. Hey, they didn't have air conditioning. They didn't have screens. Lord knows what came in and out of their houses. I'd hate to think. But if they had the salt on the floor and they walked in there, they'd run out. So you're totally correct. It kept the bugs off. And if you didn't know that, that's why you came to Sunday school, so you could learn something. Finally, class, Jesus calls us to be the light of the world. You and I are also called on to let our light shine before all who we see as good examples of what we are. Any questions? I love this lesson. Let's pray. Dear Lord, help us to be the salt of the earth, and help us to witness like a shining light that others might see Christianity in us at its best. This gift you gave us of the Sermon on the Mount needs to be remembered as one of praise and one of encouragement. We ask all of this in your wonderful name. Amen.
Amen.